Good people, I would like to initially clarify for you that, although Freemasonry does not officially declare itself a secret society, the learnings and knowledge that are developed within Freemasonry are secret and progressively revealed to the initiates.
But what does that mean?
That even Freemasons, those initiated into Freemasonry, do not have all the knowledge about Freemasonry. In other words, little by little they move up to different levels, and it is from these levels that they receive this information.
With that, in today's video, we're going to talk in general terms about what Freemasonry is and how Freemasonry has been related to Christianity over the last few centuries.
But what does Freemasonry have to do with Christianity? Well, Freemasonry does not declare itself as a religion, but there is a requirement that all members of Freemasonry do not necessarily have a religion, but have faith in a God, in a deity. So that means that in Freemasonry everyone believes in the existence of a superior deity, which they generically call the Great Architect of the Universe, or simply Gadu. So a Christian can be a Freemason, right?
Because so much protest when some Christian is identified as a Freemason.
Well, first we have to divide Christians into two sides minimally, okay? This to facilitate our discussion, and then we will divide between Catholics and Evangelicals or Protestants, and here is a very interesting observation. Especially in relation to Protestants and Evangelicals, it is difficult to treat them as a block because they are extremely diverse, okay? But let's do this, at least initially, so that we can differentiate the moments in which this association, this link between Freemasonry and Christianity, ends up being discussed throughout history.
Well, starting with the Catholic Church, since the 18th century there has been a position of the Church against the participation of Christians in Freemasonry.
In 1738, Pope Clement XII clearly stated in the document that position that Christians should not be Freemasons.
In the history of Brazil, the so-called religious question became famous. The religious issue was the following. Back in the 1870s, Brazil was living under the Padroado system, when the Pope's orders in Brazil could only be obeyed and authorized by the state, by the emperor. And there was a papal encyclical forbidding communion to anyone who was a Freemason.
And then two ultramontane Catholic bishops end up refusing to grant communion, and they are arrested. That is, the Church also had a position in the 19th century for the whole world in relation to Freemasonry.
Back in the second half of the 20th century, in 1983, the then Cardinal Joseph Hartson, who would descend Pope Benedict XVI a few years later, also declared himself clearly against the fact that a Christian was a Freemason.
For him, a Christian who became a Freemason was in sin and could not approach communion.
But at that moment the idea of excommunicating Freemasons no longer existed. Among evangelicals, the situation is even more complex. Why?
Because of what I already said back there about the heterogeneity of the Protestant movement.
And here, again, I'm going to have to subdivide.
So let's split the Protestant movement in two.
Let's call them traditional churches and Pentecostal churches.
And then, in our history, the traditional ones arrived first.
They arrived there in the 16th century, and there is already a presence of Protestants here from this more traditional line.
Gradually, these Protestants who were experiencing certain difficulties, because they had little freedom in a colony that was Christian but Catholic, they ended up being embraced by the Freemasons, and little by little you will have examples of both the faithful and even the leaders of pastors who were part of or associated with Masonic lodges.
But the situation was not as harmonious as it might seem. You begin to see friction between groups that accepted Freemasonry and groups that were against it, and that began to build an increasingly growing criticism. From these disagreements, there was even a division in the Presbyterian Church in Brazil that ended up giving rise to the Independent Presbyterian Church.
But everything I've talked about so far, you know it's related to traditional churches.
But what about Pentecostals? How did they react to this issue?
Well, between 1910 and 1911, the first two Pentecostal churches appeared in Brazil. In the order was first the Christian Congregation of Brazil Church, and soon a year later the so-called Assembly of God.
In this segment, the aversion to Freemasonry largely inherited the ideas of Catholicism, that Masonic rituals would be linked to Satanism.
Symbols, secrets, rituals, ecumenism would be incompatible with Christianity.
Fine, but then there are no Masonic Christians?
Of course there is.
And that's when things get interesting, because then there's that doubt, that mistrust about who is or who isn't, who it could be.
And then there is the gathering of evidence, whether arbitrary or not, that starts to strengthen the idea that a certain person, certain leader, certain pastor, had connections with Freemasonry. And this whole situation happens because in the Protestant imagination in general, especially in the Pentecostal, Freemasonry is prohibited. That is, a Christian should under no circumstances participate in Freemasonry.
That's why there's this mistrust, and when someone really starts to have very strong evidence, they lose the respect of the community.
I myself have seen a very interesting situation when a singer was invited to a certain church, and during the week there was great suspicion about the possibility that he had relations with Freemasonry.
The pastor of that church, which the singer was going to visit, defended the pastor's good nature for almost an hour, saying that he would never be a Freemason. That is, it is important first, before he arrives, to convince the church that he has not had relations with Freemasonry.
But therein lies a big problem. Why?
When a pastor or religious leader comes to the defense of someone who is suspected of being a Freemason, he himself begins to raise suspicions about his potential participation in Freemasonry. So it is very risky to defend someone by saying that someone is not a Freemason, because it will be discovered later that he really is. There will come some conclusions, hasty or not, that that pastor who defended him knew because he was also a Freemason. But as I said earlier, the Protestant milieu is not a block, and there are certain denominations that treat Freemasonry with a certain respect, although they warn their members that they should not participate in any association that opposes their Christian faith.
We're done here. If this video was useful to you, leave a comment, give it a like, thanks. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell.
If you want to know my courses, I left the links in the video description, in case you are interested.
Okay guys, a big hug.